Robert E. Lee, born 1807, died 1870. Follow along with me in your American Experience book beginning on page 125. I have fought against the people of the North because I believe they were seeking to wrest from the South its dearest rights. But I have never cherished toward them bitter or vindictive feelings and have never seen the day when I did not pray for them. As quoted by Charles Sherwood Ferris in The American Soul, an appreciation of the four greatest Americans and their lessons for present Americans. Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, had been a cavalry leader in the Revolutionary War, so it was no surprise when Robert enrolled in West Point Military Academy. He graduated with no demerits, perfect scores in artillery, infantry, and cavalry, and a reputation as a strong and honorable man. Robert's military success continued, particularly in the Mexican-American War and the slave revolt at Harper's Ferry. As the Civil War brewed, President Abraham Lincoln heard of Robert's military brilliance and good character and offered him command of the Union Army. While Robert believed in the Union and did not want to fight for slavery, he felt a duty to his home state. He resigned from the United States military and agreed to lead the Confederate Army. Robert's leadership style and decisions were daring and unconventional to the point of shocking his opponents, which often gave him the upper hand. In the Battle of Chancellorsville, Robert faced an army much bigger than his own, yet he instructed his forces to divide into three even smaller groups before attacking. Union Commander Joseph Hooker had no idea how to react, and Robert led his men to victory. Still, eventually the Union Army began to win the war, and in 1865, Robert surrendered to General Ulysses Grant in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Though Robert could have been hanged as a traitor, President Lincoln and General Grant honored his character by allowing him to return to his private life. Robert later became president of Washington College, which was renamed Washington and Lee after Robert passed away. The following excerpt is from True Stories of Great Americans for Young Americans by Elbridge Street Brooks and Thomas Shepard Meek, chapter The Stirring Story of Robert E. Lee, General of the Confederate Armies. This is to tell you the story of Robert E. Lee. Every boy and girl in America knows who he was, a great American soldier. But he was more than a great soldier. He was a hero, and this is a hero story. Is there any boy or girl who does not like to hear about a hero? You know what a hero is, don't you? It's one who does great deeds in a grand way. Ever since the world began, there have been heroes. Some have been soldiers. Some have been kings. Some have just been plain, poor men or boys. But the world has liked to hear their stories, from David, the boy who killed Goliath the giant, to George Washington, who delivered his land from tyranny. In this dear America, which is our native land, we have had many heroes. They have defended us in danger, fought for us in war, cared for us in peace, and every boy and girl in America has told the story of their lives and taught to love and respect and honor them. It is the story of one of these brave and heroic men that I wish now to tell you, the story of Robert E. Lee, who fought long and bravely for what he believed to be the rights and liberty of his fellow men in the southern half of the United States of America. Listen to his story. Many years ago, when your grandfather's grandfather was helping to make the 4th of July, a certain brave and gallant soldier fought in almost all the battles of the American Revolution. People called him Light Horse Harry Lee. This was because he was the leader of a number of dashing, fast-riding soldiers, or cavalry, called Light Horse, because the riders were dressed and armed as lightly as possible. In this dress, they could ride swiftly and act quickly. Light Horse Harry Lee was a splendid horseback rider, and his swift and daring dashes with his Light Horse Legion did a great deal toward whipping the British and making the American Revolution a success. General Washington thought very much of this brave Virginian horseman, and when the war was over, wrote him a letter in which he sent him his love and thanks for what he had done in the American Revolution. And when the great and good Washington died, at his beautiful home in Mount Vernon, it was his friend, the dashing cavalry soldier, who spoke those splendid words about the greatest American, words which I hope you all know by heart. Washington, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Nearly 25 years after the American Revolution ended in success, when Light Horse Harry Lee had been Governor Lee of Virginia and was writing a book about the American Revolution, a little baby boy was born into the pleasant Virginian home. This baby was named Robert Edward Lee, and he was to grow up to become an even greater and nobler man than his famous father. Robert E. Lee was born on the 19th of January, 1807, the very year in which our great American poets Longfellow and Whittier were born. His father's house was at a beautiful country place in Virginia called Stafford. It was in Westmoreland County on the Potomac River, the very county in Virginia in which George Washington was born, and on the banks of the same Potomac River. He was a good boy in everything, good in his home, good in his school, good in his looks, and good in his ways. His father was not very well when Robert was a little boy and had to be away from the home a great deal for good health, so Robert's mother brought her boy up. She brought him up well and made a man of him because she made him true and manly from the start. He was never what a little boy called a sissy, just because he was mild and good, but he was manly, brave, true-hearted little fellow, kind all about him and always in love with his mother, always obeying her, attentive to his studies, doing his duty in every way as a real boy should. When Robert was 4 years old, his father moved from his country home at Stafford to the little city of Alexandria, quite near to Washington, the capital of the nation. There Robert went to school in a queer old-fashioned yellow house that is still standing in Alexandria and is still used for a boys' school. Its right name was Hallowell's School from the master who kept it, but the boys who went there called it because of its yellow walls, Brimstone Castle. When Robert was 11 years old, his father, the famous Light Horse Harry Lee of the American Revolution, died in Georgia, where he had gone for his health. The fatherless boy clung closer to his mother than ever and determined to do everything he could to help her, but he had such a great respect for his father's memory and felt so much pride in the deeds his famous father had done in the cause of liberty in his native land that when the time came for him to decide what he would do when he became a man, he declared he would be a soldier, just as his father had been. So he went to West Point, the famous military academy on the banks of the Hudson River, where the United States trains boys to lead its armies and fight its battles. Robert E. Lee stayed 4 years at West Point. He entered there as a plebe, or new boy, in 1825 when he was 18 years old, and leaving it, or graduating as it is called, as Lieutenant Lee in 1829. He did finely at that famous school. He was what they called a model cadet, always spick and span in his gray and white soldier suit, always at the head in his studies, always ready in his duties, in his drill, and in all he had to do. He never received a demerit or bad mark in all the 4 years he was a cadet at West Point. Think of that. They said there that Cadet Lee kept his gun so bright and clean that the inspecting officer could fairly see his face in its gleaming barrel and its polished stock. He was such a fine scholar at West Point that when he got through and graduated, he stood second in his class. That is, next to head, you know. This gave him a chance to choose just where he would like to be in the Army when he came out of West Point. He joined what is called the Engineer Corps, the pick of the whole Army. The Engineer Corps is made up of men who look after building the forts and defenses of our harbors, set our river canals straight, and protect the land from the sea as well as from the enemy. It is a fine position for a young officer and generally gives him pleasant places to live in and agreeable things to do. Soldiers like it better than being sent off to lonely posts or to watching Indians, and it gives them a fine training in how to do things about forts and fighting. Lieutenant Lee was stationed at different places along the Atlantic coast. He helped plan and build Fortress Monroe on the beautiful Hampton Roads in Virginia. He was stationed in Washington, in one of the offices of the big War Department. He helped lay the boundary line between the states of Ohio and Michigan. He looked after the improvement of the harbor of St. Louis and the changes that were made in the shifting channel of the mighty Mississippi River. He superintended the building of the forts in New York Harbor, and when he got back from a war, which I will soon tell you about, he was made superintendent of the very place he had gone to school, the Military Academy at West Point. After that, he commanded all of the United States troops in Texas. He was second lieutenant in 1829, then first lieutenant, then in 1838, captain in the regular army. So you see, he kept going right on in the world and was a great deal thought of in the Army. The United States did not have a very big army in those days, but whenever there was a war, it grew quickly. In the year 1846, there came about a war between the United States and its next-door neighbor, the Republic of Mexico. Never mind what it was all about. You will learn that when you study the history of the United States. It was a cruel war, as all war is cruel. But it was a great chance for Americans who wished to be real soldiers to show what they were good for and what they could do. They did well. They marched into Mexico, which is just the other side of Texas, you know, and they fought so bravely that in less than 2 years they had conquered Mexico and added to the United States all the land from Texas to California and the Pacific Ocean. In this war, Robert E. Lee made a splendid soldier. He was so brave and gallant, so ready and reliable, that he was always to be found where the fighting was fiercest. And yet, he was so gentle and kind that he always stuck at the point in the enemy's line where they could be beaten the quickest, so as to finish the fight with the smallest loss of men in killed and wounded. There was one battle in Mexico in which the young engineer was almost the leader and conqueror. This was the time when he got the best of the Mexicans at a place called Cerro Gordo, high up in the mountains. The Mexican soldiers held the zigzag road up in the mountains. It ran between great cliffs and chasms and had cannons all along so as to keep the Americans from coming up. But Captain Lee, the engineer, said, "If we can't march against them, we must get behind them. I'll try." He hunted all about for a good place and at last saw a way by which a sort of path could be cut through the mountains and come out behind the Mexicans. He did this so carefully, so swiftly, and so silently that before the Mexicans knew what they were about, he was right upon them. Captain Lee led the way and showed the men just what to do. They lowered the cannons by ropes down the steep cliff and hauled them up on the opposite hillside. They cut and climbed and jumped and dug until they got all the men, all the horses, and all the cannons up behind the Mexican line. Then they turned their guns upon the enemy and so surprised and terrified them that almost without a blow, all that part of the Mexican army surrendered to the American commander, General Scott. This was one of Captain Lee's victories in Mexico. It was one of the kind he liked because he had to think it out. It was the best kind of victory, too, for he won it without having to shoot down and kill very many men. For his courage and his soldiership, he was again and again promoted. Captain, Major, Lieutenant Colonel, Colonel. He was on staff of the commander, Winfield Scott, the general of the American Army. And after the Mexican War was over, General Scott declared that his success in Mexico was largely due to the skill, valor, and undaunted courage of Robert E. Lee. That is a good deal to say about one man, is it not? And fine, too. After the Mexican War was over and all the soldiers had come home again, Colonel Lee was made superintendent of the military academy at West Point, as I have already told you. For 3 years, he was in charge there, directing the soldier boys in their studies and their drilling at that splendid military school on the banks of the Hudson. Then he was sent to join the Army stationed in Texas. He was colonel of a cavalry regiment, the same position that his famous father, Light Horse Harry, had held in the Army of the Republic. Later on, he was placed in command of all the soldiers in what was called the Department of Texas. While he was home on a long vacation at his beautiful home in Virginia called Arlington, just opposite Washington, the Civil War broke out. You know what that was, of course, the dreadful and terrible trouble between two parts of our dear native land, the North and the South. It could not be settled peaceably. Men thought so differently about things that one side would not give in to the other, and so they just had to fight it out. It was a long and bitter war. Many good and brave men were killed on both sides, and there was sorrow and distress all over the land. But when the war was over, the people of the United States became better friends than they had ever been before, and there will never be such a war again. When the war broke out, Colonel Robert E. Lee did not know just what to do. But he thought the matter over long and deeply, and then he said, "I cannot fight against my relatives, my children, my home. I have been a soldier of the United States, but I am a son of Virginia, and I must do as my state does." He resigned from the United States Army, giving up his position of colonel, and was made Major General of the forces of the state of Virginia. When West Virginia went out of the Union, That is, when her people said, "We will not belong to the United States any longer. We will join the Confederate States," Colonel Lee said, "Then I must go with you." He was appointed military advisor to Jefferson Davis, the president of the newly formed Confederate States, for so the states that went out of the Union called themselves. A year later, he was made commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, and for 3 years he led the brave Southern soldiers who fought for the Confederacy against the brave Northern soldiers who fought for the Union. What a splendid leader of those gallant Southern soldiers General Lee was. He knew just where to have them march, just when to have them fight, and just what to have them do. Richmond, in Virginia, was the state of the Confederate States, just as Washington is the capital of the United States. General Lee surrounded it with forts and defended it so skillfully that the Northern soldiers could not get into it, though they tried again and again, and whenever they tried to get through any of the approaches to the city, General Lee would march his soldiers against them and fight long and desperately. Boys, when they play at any good game, like a boy to be their leader. You can do so much better if you have someone to follow, someone who shows you what to do. It is just so with men, especially soldiers, and General Lee was just such a leader. His soldiers learned to love him and look up to him almost as you do your own father. They called him Marsa Bob and Uncle Bobby, not to his face, of course, but when they talked together about him. He was so kind and patient and gentle. He was always trying to help them and cared for them so much that they knew he was their friend, even when he made them march the longest, and even when he made them fight the hardest. But a soldier has to fight, you know. That is why he is a soldier. And although General Lee was always calm and quiet and gentle in speech and manner, he was a great soldier and sometimes a fierce fighter. One day, when there was a terrible battle raging, he saw his soldiers beaten back by the Union troops from a place he wished them to keep. "They must not lose it," he said, and he waved his sword above his head and dashed to the front to lead his soldiers into the battle again. But his men knew that General Lee's life was precious, that if he were killed, there would be no one to lead them to victory. "No, no, General," they cried. Go back, Lee, to the rear. We'll take it." And when he dropped back, he saluted his soldiers for their love and care for him and pointed at the Union line with his sword. "Forward," he said, and his men charging forward, thinking of their brave and gallant leader, won back the place from which they had been driven. Once when his own son, who was also the commander of a large Confederate force of cavalry, as his father and grandfather had been, you know, was in danger of being surrounded by a great force of the enemy, his father, the general, cried out cheerfully, "Keep your men together, General. I'll get you out of this." And he did. "General," a young officer shouted, dashing up to him just as a great battle was to begin, "the Federals are advancing." General Lee looked at him with a funny smile, enjoying the officer's excitement. "Well," he said, just as cool and as calm as you please, "I did hear firing, and I was just beginning to think it was time some of you lazy young fellows were coming to me to tell me what it was all about." And I suppose that made the young officer laugh right on the edge of battle, and to get that from his calm and cool general, all the more courage to do his best. So you see, while he was brave and serious, he could see the funny side of things too, and did all he could to make his soldiers bright as well as brave, hopeful when things went wrong, calm in the midst of danger. This is what makes a real soldier, you know. The North had more men and more money than the South. They kept on fighting, too, for neither side was willing to give in. But the North, for a long time, could get no soldier who was as great a general as Lee. On the 3rd day of June, 1862, he was made General of the Army of Northern Virginia. That post he held through the war. Under that name, he led the Southern soldiers to battle and often to victory, while, by his wise way of directing men, he kept the Northern troops away from Richmond for nearly 3 years. He won the Battle of Malvern Hill. He won the Second Battle of Bull Run. He won the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Twice he marched his soldiers into the Northern lines. And at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania in 1863, he fought a terrible 2 days battle, which called for all the strength and all the skill of General Meade, the Northern leader, to turn it into a victory for the Union. 4 generals of the Union led the armies against him in 4 great attempts to defeat and conquer him. But each time Lee was more than a match, and they fell back from Richmond defeated. At last, in the beginning of the year 1864, General U.S. Grant, who had been a successful leader of the Union soldiers in the West, was called to the East to take command of the armies of the United States. Then there came a change. General Grant knew all about General Lee. They had both been in the Mexican War. He knew that to win, he must do his very best. When someone asked him how long it would take him to get to Richmond, General Grant said, "Well, about 4 days if General Lee is willing. If he isn't, well, it's going to take a good deal longer." And it did. General Lee did object. He objected with guns and swords and men, and the soldiers of the North and the soldiers of the South fought many terrible battles. The fighting grew fiercer and hotter. Grant would never give up, but kept pressing on. Bit by bit, the Union soldiers drew about Richmond. Bit by bit, the Confederate soldiers gave way as their money, their strength, and their numbers began to fail. But they fought gallantly still. General Lee was watchful and determined. His eyes saw every weak spot in the Union line. He could spread out his brave but tired and hungry soldiers so as to make the best show, and his men loved him so well and followed him so willingly that he was able to keep up the fight longer than any other general could have done. Never before in all the world had so many men been brought face to face in battle, and dreadful battles they were, there in the swamps and woods and fields of Virginia in the year 1864. It was because both sides were brave men, and because brave and great generals led them, that these battles were so fierce, for Grant was bound to win, and Lee was bound not to let him. But when at last all hope of successfully defending Richmond was gone, when the brave chieftain had tried to break his way through the lines of Union soldiers who now surrounded his army and had failed, when he saw that to keep up the fight any longer was only a useless killing of men, a thing he always hated and tried to stop, then General Lee laid down his sword and surrendered himself and his army to his great foeman, General Grant, a man as gentle, as honorable, and as kindly-hearted as he. It was a sad day for General Lee when he at last determined to give up the battle. At first, when one of his soldiers saw how useless it would be to fight any longer and told the general that he ought to surrender, the grand old soldier straightened himself up and said, "Surrender? No, sir. I have too many good fighting men for that." But General Grant had more. And so, as I told you, General Lee saw this at last, and to stop the killing of any more brave men, he gave it up. That is, he surrendered. It all came to an end at last at a place called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. It was on the 9th day of April, 1865. The two generals met between the lines at a farmhouse near an apple orchard and talked it all over. Both were glad to stop fighting. Both were proud of the heroism of their men, and proud also of the courage of the other side, for all were Americans. General Grant said to General Lee, "If you will only promise for yourself and your soldiers not to fight any more against the United States, that is all I ask." General Lee promised, and so the great Civil War that ever was fought was ended in the kindest way, just because both leaders were great as well as good, and when they made a promise, they would keep it. Important words and notes. Demerits are penalties or marks on one's record, usually at school. Brimstone. Brimstone is another name for sulfur, a yellow element that smells of rotten eggs. Plebian. Plebian usually means someone of low class. It was used as a term for commoners in ancient Rome, also called a plebe. Stock. Referring to the wooden, almost triangle-shaped part of a rifle that you put to your shoulder when fighting. Corps. Corps is the French word for body, coming from the Latin word corpus, also meaning body. Cerro Gordo is on the southeast coast of Mexico. Marse Bob. Marse is a shortened way of saying master. General U.S. Grant is short for General Ulysses S. Grant.